what are we standing up for? The ability, the freedom to do what's right as God defines that right.
God's the ultimate author of liberty.
We don't want government to stand between us and our freedom to do what is right.
Hello, and thanks for coming to the Bible Nation podcast. I'm Doug Levesque, and joining me today, as always, are two of my good friends, Michigan's top cultural influencers, Mr. Tony Nash, a business owner, AZ Business Solutions in Owasso, Michigan, specialist in all form of advertising and promotions, and my favorite church, Pastor Jason Georges of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Corunna, Michigan, and he's one of the most active movers of societal thought today. And together we're going to discuss the concept of civil disobedience. We believe that the best culture is a Bible culture. It's proven and it works. Check out all of today's topics, articles, books, and of course our podcast at BibleNation.org. Good morning, men.
Good morning. That was in sync.
You like that?
That was
Practiced.
You guys, yeah, the choir. Most people, when they hear civil disobedience, college-educated America, think of Henry David Thoreau's book.
Yeah.
And Thoreau was basically against the war in Mexico when that was written. He thought, why are we a big nation picking on a little nation, and I'm not going to pay taxes. And that's really what it was coming down to. I'm not going to pay taxes. Mm-hmm. There were then other events where people looked to him for that kind of leadership, but he didn't stand on that. So he was kind of pick and choose your civil disobedience, mm-hmm. which I guess is always the case. Mm-hmm. But then there are modern illustrations of civil disobedience. Gandhi, for one. Gandhi, a practicing Hindu, wise man, shaman, whatever. I don't know if he was as well liked as the movies portray him, mm-hmm. but nevertheless, he was against the tyranny of the British, and did raise untold millions to practice a nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, and he, believed in that. He quoted, everything, and so there at the same time there was violent resistance.
Sure.
So there was other people within India that were practicing something else, and of course he left that legacy. Martin Luther King, in the United States, talked about nonviolent disobedience, civil disobedience, and practiced it as well. And so there's a lot of historical allusions to civil disobedience. Today, there's things going on all over the world and under the guise of civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. You've got in Hong Kong. China has taken over Hong Kong. There was going to be 50 years of a interim government where Hong Kong could self-rule itself. Well, that's done. China lied. And so now they're in on Hong Kong. So, Hong Kong, with its Western ideals, is trying to practice civil disobedience to very little effect. Mm-hmm. Because even though it's in the press, they're just getting beat up and arrested, and who knows what's going to happen, in that. In the Sudan, there is a whole lot of civil disobedience against a military coup that's just taken place. So, they're talking about that. So there's illustrations all over the place of, civil disobedience. It's hard to do in tyrannical instances. Mm-hmm. It's probably more effective where you've got, an India that had an English parliament. There are people who were elected, and, it's probably more effective in the United States in the civil rights era, et cetera, et cetera. But that's where we are. We're in the West. We're in the United States of America. And civil disobedience probably, more effective here. We say nonviolent because, like, BLM hasn't been a nonviolent Martin Luther King style civil disobedience.
No,
it's been
in most cases.
A violent destruction of people, property, et cetera, et cetera. Today, people are talking about it because the government is seeming to put mandates down beyond where a comfort level is for at least half the population. And so Governor DeSantis obviously is saying no to the federal government on a number of different issues, and then people are fighting him in his own state on that. And he recently came out and told his state, disobey. Mm-hmm. Disobey. He said that. And so he was really referring to nonviolent disobedience. Mm-hmm. He was referring to civil disobedience to something that is deemed tyrannical. So, man, that is pertinent today.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. And so what about the Christian? Should a Christian obey the government, or should a Christian disobey the government? to what level can we do that? Should we, should we do that? I found Stanford, which is a great law school, has online encyclopedia, and they do a good job, I think, defining civil disobedience. I mean, it's always in who owns the vocabulary, right? This is been substantially revised in 2021 this summer. So why was it substantially revised? Because it's the issue of the day. From the Boston Tea Party to Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March, and from suffragists illegal casting their ballots to white-only lunch counter sit-ins, civil disobedience has often played a critical role in bending the proverbial arc of the moral universe towards justice. But what, if anything, do these acts and countless others, which we refer to as civil disobedience, have in common? What distinguishes them from other forms of conscientious and political action? On the most widely accepted account, civil disobedience is a public, nonviolent, and conscientious breach of law undertaken with the aim of bringing about a change in laws or government policies. On this account, people who engage in civil disobedience operate at the boundary of fidelity to law, have general respect for their regime, and are willing to accept the legal consequences of their actions as evidence of their fidelity to the rule of law. Civil disobedience, given its place at the boundary of fidelity to law, is set on this view to fall between legal protest on the one hand and conscientious refusal, uncivil disobedience, militant protest, organized forcible resistance, and revolutionary action on the other hand. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good, definition. And that's why it could be confusing, because if we live in a place that democratically we can make laws, then, technically in a utopian society, we should never have to civilly disobey, because we can just try to go back and change the law.
Yeah,
right.
There's a process.
Right. And if it's a true tyranny and everyone agrees, then we can organize a militia, and overthrow the government and overthrow the lawmakers or whatever. So, but in between is this idea of civil disobedience with all the historical markers. Where did this come from? I think there's a biblical precedent for it, but it could be overdone. And where Christians don't really know their rights, it can be underdone. So we're in this fix. I mean, I'm an American, but I'm a Christian. So, in last week's podcast, where do I defend myself?
Right.
In this week's podcast, can I practice civil disobedience? So that's really the question of the day.
The quandary.
And I think, you're bringing in the Christian perspective on this, or the Christian, and when should they civilly disobey? And I would take it a step further back and saying Christians are ignorant of their true convictions. Because once you have a conviction, then the line of civil disobedience becomes very easy. And conviction means convinced. And so convinced by the inspiration of Scripture, matched with the indwelt Holy Spirit, convinced of a truth that you realize this is right or that is wrong, this is true, that is false. And I've crossed the threshold of my mind that I can't be complicit in a lie, or I can't go across a boundary. Now, once that line has been drawn, the principle of the matter, the civil disobedience becomes a little bit more obvious. It's not cloudy.
So recently, when the governor mandated no church, and it was happening universally across half of America, your church stayed open.
Right.
And so tell us, you were convinced. How were you convinced? What did you do? Did you receive grief from civil authorities? Did you receive grief from other Christians?
Yeah. Well, so, first of all, as government was reacting to an environmental issue, that's what the virus was at that time. As government was reacting, they are still confined to act lawfully. And in some of their decisions, they started infringing on assembly. But particularly when it started coming to the assembly of the church. Now, I can, as an American, disagree that they should infringe on my right to assemble politically, but they don't have jurisdiction over the assembly of the church. That's a decision for the church to make. And so the principle, the conviction was very clear. The government has no authority over the assembly of the church, God's institution, and I would say an institution parallel to the government, not the same as government, but parallel along with the family as well. So the decision on what to do was, we knew we had to inherently assemble. Now, we ought to do it with prudence. So one of the things I did as we were making that decision and going forward, knowing that we were a little bit of an outlier during that time, is I called the sheriff. And I said, Sheriff, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. We're not meaning to rabble rouse. We're not meaning to cause a scene. This is not a political statement. These are deeply held convictions. We mean no trouble to the community, whatnot. I just putting this on your radar map. And of course, there was a reply of, no, thank you for that communication. And we've had a good relationship with him. And I, here in Shiawassee County, have very much appreciated Sheriff Begol's leadership in understanding his constitutional confines and allowing people within reason to operate within those things. And we've appreciated that and then operated within that thing. But
what did your church do to meet?
So, well, we never, through the whole pandemic, we always met weekly inside. So we have a midweek service that never ceased. We never stopped. Every week, someone was in the building. But as the media hysteria was going on, I mean, there was a proverbial running for the hills.
Right.
So the first 2 weeks into it, we saw our attendance go from regular 60% down 60% down to 25%, and realizing, okay, people are scared, they're nervous. We got to make a strategic leadership decision on how to get their confidence of assembly back together. And so then we did 6 weeks of drive-in church, assembling in the parking lot, which ended up being a big boon, because that was a point that people could. It was a form of civil disobedience in a sense, because this was during the time when they said we're not even supposed to drive unless you're essential. Well, of course, we believe church is essential,
right?
But it was. People were still trying to make up their medical decision. They weren't sure personally what the virus was and how to deal with it.
We didn't realize all the rigmarole. Yeah.
So it was a reasonable approach. But what I was trying to do was reinforce in their mind the necessity of assembly.
Right.
And so let's at least say assembling together in the car meets the line. We're going to be together on the property. Not that the property has any special place. It's just the place where we're allowed to park such in the cars without any issue. And we could have met anywhere. We could have met the Meyer parking lot. So it's not about that place particular, but we're going to assemble together at the appointed time in a manner that allows everyone to continue to go through the process of what they needed to do for their own medical safety. Now, as we progress, we begin to see that this was less about a pandemic and more about the politics.
Right.
And we saw the actions being inconsistent, because if it was simply about a pandemic, the actions would have been consistent all the way across, but they weren't.
Right.
Who could get their boat out? I mean, okay, we all the things that we got to enjoy here in Michigan, which then leads to the rising of groups like Stand Up Michigan.
Right.
Then I remember after Resurrection Sunday, that was our first battle line of we're going to preserve Resurrection Sunday. We had 3 more weeks after that, but I had set the course in my mind and heart. I have to lead them back into the building because this is political now, and they can't go in the building. I can't allow the congregation to believe that they're not allowed to go back into their church building.
Right.
Yeah.
Now it's still their decision.
Right.
And so we made opportunities, but I couldn't let the idea seed in their mind that they're not allowed, because that's not an allowance that's for the government to give or take from them. So we 3 messages of from the scaffolding up in the air, preparing them to go back in the building. Then we had that first back in the building on a Sunday morning. So this is our largest crowd. But we still made available the drive-in, and we still made available the online. And we had about 50-50. Yeah.
It was reasonable.
Because I wanted the decision to be theirs. It was their decision before God.
Right.
And so even like what we see right now with the vaccine, the vaccine, to vax or unvax ought to be a personal decision. What's ultimately immoral is the mandate, which is now being enforced by you losing your ability to provide for your family.
Right.
I mean, that's crossing a line.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, that's
sacred space.
That's akin to the self-defense line.
Yeah.
I mean,
sacred space.
I can't provide. You're hampering my ability to provide for my family, which is a God-ordained duty.
Right.
If a man does not provide for his family, he's worse than an infidel.
Right.
So now you're standing between me and my ability to fulfill my God-ordained obligation. At some point, I have to rebel against that.
Right.
And he uses the word rebel.
Yeah.
So Tony, I was going to ask you then. So all of Michigan stood up.
Yeah.
I mean, the news was somewhere between, there was 1,000 people, but there was tens of thousands of cars and maybe 100,000 people that crossed the law, drove their car to Lansing, stopped the freeways, stopped all traffic, honked their horn, spent several hours basically in a statewide protest.
Yeah. Operation Gridlock.
Yeah, and you were there, and
Yep.
so tell me, what was the thinking behind all of that? What was,
Well, I called him and I said, "Hey, you want to go to Lansing? This sounds interesting." I mean, we were all for seeing what was going on. We were definitely
Sounded like fun, too.
We were definitely against what was happening, and we thought, well, just go see what's going on at the Capitol. And we drove, and we didn't know what to expect. And we saw online. I mean, there was this group, Michiganders Against Excessive Quarantine, that had like almost 400,000 members, and there was a lot of chatter about this. So we're like, this is going to be probably a big event. And we literally, I mean, our car moved a block in 4 hours. I mean, it was, and I've looked at all the drone footage. There was 10,000 cars there, easy. I mean, it was backed up to 496 to 127, all the side streets, and it just honking and crazy, and people were making their message heard. And out of that came a lot of people just saying, we're going to stand up and say this isn't right. And I think
it was really a huge act, hundreds of thousands in civil disobedience to say, we're not going to do this. We don't want to do this. We were crying out to the legislature. We were crying out to the governor, maybe in some sense crying out to God. And we didn't get the exact results that we thought, but individually the courts,
well, the idea of it was,
ended up winning the day.
Yeah.
On that.
And the idea of it was the message that this is not okay. There are thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people that say no. And we, the people, coming together to say, those of you in government who work for us, we're saying, this isn't right. You've gone too far. You've crossed the line.
Right.
We're being peaceful. There was no buildings burned that day. Nobody was shot.
Right.
There was nothing. It was just people in their cars. And, they asked not to get out of their cars. I got out of my car and walked up the whole thing, talked to hundreds of people.
Yeah.
And people were there for all the same reason.
Yeah.
And I know for me, and I think all of us as Christian men, the thing that we always ask ourselves when it comes to this idea of civil disobedience, or should I obey this, should I, is the first thing, is there a Bible precedent? Are there times in the Bible where the government said not to do something and Christian people did it anyways?
Right.
And so I think there are a lot of biblical examples, and I know that's one of the things we want to talk about. But certainly for us, especially in context of this podcast, what does the Bible say about it? Is there a time to disobey? And I would say yes.
So let's talk about a couple of the Bible examples, of what we would say is civil disobedience. My favorite, one of my favorite characters of the Bible is Daniel. He was in a situation where he was a glorified slave, wasn't really a choice.
Right.
Some people say that he was made a eunuch, and the Bible kind of gives some evidence of that. So, I mean, talk about no rights, but lots of responsibility. So he was already in a bad situation, and his enemy said, we're going to get him through his prayer life. And so let's make this law, no prayer. You can only pray to the emperor, pray to a man as a god, sort of thing. And Daniel just said, I can't do that. So he opened his windows. He prayed publicly, that that everybody could see, and he knew what the consequences were, and basically was willing to suffer the consequences. He got thrown in what they call Daniel's lion's den. He got thrown in the lion's den, and he was willing to die. He was willing to die. He was willing to suffer for that. And the Bible really has that principle that, to suffer for well-doing is acceptable to God. And, Daniel did that. God delivered him. The king knew he had done wrong, was definitely repentant, pulled Daniel out, and immediately threw all the enemies into the lion's den. So, it really worked out. And, I thought, Daniel had loyal service to government authority. It wasn't a matter of not liking or wanting or needing government authority. This involves speaking truth to power. He had clearly communicated with the king on numerous occasions difficult things that the king would not have want to heard. And so I think before you civilly disobey, you ought to have shown some loyalty to authority and government. Secondly, you ought to have clearly communicated what your issue is. You can't just be a rebel without clearly communicating, I don't think this is right. Can we do something like that? And then the public demonstration of doing right, as opposed to just a private disobedience or just going along, And a lot of people, that's kind of where they want, well, I'm not going to obey this in their home at midnight, But Daniel opened the windows and said, no, this is wrong. This was a public demonstration. That's really part of civil disobedience. And then he was willing to suffer the consequences. That's the Stanford definition. And so that is not just Mr. Stanford. That comes from biblical precedent at Law and Action. with Daniel. And Pastor, you've got to know there's other ones. Is there something on your mind as far as that goes with biblical concepts?
I mean, obviously, in the Acts of the Apostles, I mean, the apostles, Peter was in prison for preaching the gospel when his civil authority told him, no, you can't be preaching.
Yeah.
And, we come to that verse, Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than
That's the verse I was
man.
just trying to look up. I'm glad you found it.
Yeah, we
No.
got to obey God rather than me. Yeah.
Yeah, we ought to obey God rather than man.
Right.
And so there was this civil disobedience against human authority.
And
That-
again, an angel interfered.
Yeah.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. Well, and there was deliverance, and that's what's remarkable.
There's not always deliverance.
But
Yeah.
but
I mean,
even
I think of the three Hebrew
the,
boys.
the Hebrew boys went in and they said, Nebuchadnezzar, we might burn up,
Yeah.
and we might God. We believe God can preserve us,
Right.
But he almost likes, but we're
they were
also
willing to
right.
be burned.
We're willing to be. Just know this: we're not bowing to you.
Right.
That was the statement,
Right.
And that's what the statement of civil disobedience is. And you think about the gridlock thing that we participated in, which was the start. Well, while it did not in the immediate produce the political response we wanted, it did consolidate or bring together the
Yeah.
people, and that's what that's the other role of
Right.
civil disobedience is to give encouragement,
That's great.
strength
That's excellent.
to other
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And so one man's obedience to something higher, which is the rule of the Christian governing authority of civil disobedience. I'll
Right.
say it here in a second. But one man standing up leads to a lot of people standing up. What's our good friend Garrett Sedano
The
say?
power of one can lead to the power of many.
I don't know where I feel like he got that from a movie. But
Maybe. He
yeah,
says it all
but
the
it
time.
works.
That was from Rudy.
Yeah,
was
the
it?
power of one.
He's a football guy.
Actually, there was an old movie about a South African boxer in apartheid, and he was, and it was called The Power of One.
Okay.
Anyways, look
Okay.
that up.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It's actually a good movie. It's wholesome. It's a wholesome movie. You
Yeah,
can watch
yeah,
it.
yeah.
I think Morgan Freeman's in it.
Oh, that's
He's
gotta be
good.
It's got to be good.
He's the trainer. He's the trainer. But
Yeah.
That's
but
a good role. He's
so
the same character in every movie.
so particularly for a Christian. So what does Peter say? We ought to obey God rather than man.
Right.
Okay.
When it comes in conflict.
When it comes to conflict, right. Civil disobedience must always be in obedience to a higher authority.
That's
Right.
good.
That's what.
That's the principle.
That's the principle for a believer. It's
Yeah.
not just anarchy. It's not. Well, you know what? I don't like this.
not just
or,
rebellion.
Or it's not Fox News told me to do it.
Right.
Because I'm an R and they're D's and
Right.
no, I actually there's very little for the parties that I'm willing to
Right.
civilly disobey.
Right.
Correct.
No,
Right.
but
Can't just be a party member. Yeah.
right. If it's a political thing that we're going to get together, and I ain't going to jail for the Republican Party
Right.
or the Democratic Party or any other party, but I will go to jail. I will go to jail in obedience
To God.
to God.
Yeah. Because and I mean that's happened.
And that will be
throughout.
that'll be a great night.
So Tony,
And
you,
that's what people need to understand.
Right.
Is
Yeah.
that it comes down to that principle.
yeah.
That
You were saying
I'm not defiant of government, but I'm more interested in obeying God.
so when Christians on the other side of it will argue and say, no, Romans 13, you have to obey, be in subjection to the higher powers. You have to obey the government. You have to pay your taxes. You have to do this. You have to do that. And Jesus caught the fish and had the coin to pay the taxes and all these kinds of things. So you're a businessman. I mean, where does the conflict come in?
Well, I mean, here in America, the Constitution starts with "we the people"
Right.
in order to form a more perfect union. I mean, we're in charge. So, I mean, if you want to talk about obeying the government, we are technically in
Right.
charge. So, I
Our
mean, there's
forefathers said that over and over.
understanding the way our government works.
Right.
There is that principle there, and there is a line that authority can cross where they go back to the principle, obey God rather than, where they have infringed on my right to worship, to assemble, to provide for my family, those types of things. So there is a line. As a business owner, we were faced with the decision: do we stay open or close? It was kind of unclear what we weren't listed as a specific industry. That there was nothing about office or marketing companies, but
Yeah.
certainly everyone in this building that we're in today went home. The Chamber of Commerce went home. Every other business closed, went from home, and we stayed for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And I noticed a few of the employees were getting a little nervous.
Yeah.
Their spouses were working from home, so I said, "All right, let's just try to work from home for a couple of weeks. That's
Right.
reasonable." And I went to their homes, set up an office for them,
Yep.
got them, and we tried to do the remote thing to be responsible, and it just didn't work for us. And so I said, we're coming back.
Yeah.
And we had to have a special fob to get in the building. We were the only ones in this building for months. It was like a ghost town in here. Yeah. But we just said we're going to do it. And we also said not only are we going to stay open, we're going to be responsible, but we are going to help other businesses in need. And we just decided to double down on our efforts to help businesses that were struggling, get their message out online. People needed to adapt to online ordering, drive-up services, getting their products listed online, e-commerce. And so we found that we were able to help a lot of businesses. And in turn, I mean, our business really grew throughout the pandemic. And that's not why we did it. We just principally knew, like, this is what we're going to do. They don't have the right to tell me I cannot stay open and provide for my family. And so that's why we decided to do it.
I think, and you know, it was principled. It wasn't greedy or anything. It was principled. The same
definitely
thing
not greedy.
The church grew during that time because it was principled. It wasn't trying to grow. It was just trying to do what was right. And, you know, our forefathers really, they were Englishmen. The Revolutionary War was viewed as a rebellion in England, and it was really seen as a civil war on this side of the ocean between the Tories and the rebels, you know, or whatever. And, you know, by the way, there is probably a historical list of at least 4,000, maybe 5,000 Tory families that were funded by the Brits to leave the country or go to Canada or go back home. And their stories are written like heroes. These were Tories that left their land. There's not one Baptist listed in the whole list of the Tories. Because even though the Baptists, this is a great little side note, the Baptists were persecuted by some of the colonies had the state religion, and they were that they would tax for, you know, the Congregationalists or for the Anglicans or whatever, and the Baptists wouldn't pay the tax, and so they went to jail. They had their property confiscated. They were suffering, and so they didn't like taxation without representation. Okay, so this is where that came from. They didn't like the Stamp Act because so their principles kind of bled in everywhere else. And so when they were confronted with fighting, they went to Washington and said, why should we fight with you? Because they had appealed to the king for their religious liberty, and the king had always backed the Baptists in the United States. So they were like, what are we going to do here? They decided, Washington said, no, I hate every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Right. And that was the leadership's idea. But, you know, actually, John Adams was for the taxation. George Washington was for the taxation. Jefferson was not. Madison was not. So this is a real issue. Ultimately, Baptists were 70% of the population somewhere. And so because they were setting up this form of government different than the king, they realized, oh man, we're subject to these Baptists. We got to get voted on by these Baptists. So the Baptists were able to win on religious liberty, even though that, you know, that wasn't the case.
Or at least a lot Baptists, and then even to make it broader, a lot of biblicists, Bible people that were against state church. That was the state can't tell me what I am or make me something I'm not, because even at the very beginning of the founding of the colonies, you still had communities that were determining what they were, whether they were Lutheran or what, and then they were exercising the tithe with the political arm in the entire community, even though if you weren't Lutheran. I had to pay the Lutheran tithe.
And so Michael Flynn, Trump's DIA director, you know, he was not DIA director very long, but he was a general. You know, he wrote a book on Christian civilization and the trouble we're facing, and I thought that was a good book. But then recently, just a few days ago, he came out and said, in kind of a Trumpish-like rally, that we should be a singular Christian nation, no other religions. We should state that. Well, he's gotten in trouble for that because Baptists would say, no. We don't believe in coercion. We believe that, you know, give a free market of ideas and the best ideas will win.
And the gospel will win every time.
And the gospel does win. In America, it has for, you know, many decades, many century now. But one of the things that we would practice civil disobedience for is the right of assembly of church, the right to preach. If it becomes a hate crime in order to preach that sodomy is an abomination, if that becomes a hate crime, well, we're going to preach that, and we're going to suffer the fines or suffer the jail time. So, you know, this is a huge process. And I guess let's bring it down to today before we finish. Is that today there's mandates. There's mandates to get shots and then boosters, and it's just ridiculous because first it was just going to be a couple weeks, and then it was going to be masks, and then it was going to be shutdowns and quarantines, and then we would never mandate this, but people need this, and then it turned into a mandate. You have to have this,
Right.
and of course that's held up. The OSHA laws that Biden has, basically dictated are held up in the courts, but who knows how long that's going to happen,
Right.
or if there's incrementalism, But certainly,
And those things are only being held up because of the way our country was founded, because of our Constitution.
because they
But
make
they're
it hard
trying to
to
push
move
it forward, right?
But then you've got the culture with, businesses and stuff coming against people. And so I'd like you guys to speak to that. Employees, church members, they're going to say, okay, no, I think that I'm sacred space. Nobody could mandate this thing in my arm. If I choose to get it, that's one thing. If I don't want it, I shouldn't have to do this. The math doesn't work on this thing. It's not as big a thing as it
Yeah.
is what it is. And so there's definitely this political idea to it, and now you're trying to force political control. And so I'm gonna say no on that matter. Maybe not religious, but just on political conscientiousness. I'm not going to do this. And so now they're losing their jobs. So how do you speak to that?
Well, first of all, here at AZ, we don't require any vaccination status. We're hiring if you're looking for a job. We're not going to ask you if you're vaccinated. It's not our business. That's kind of my philosophy, is what people do in their own medical procedures is their decision. We don't ask. I don't know which of my employees are or aren't.
Right.
It's just not.
There's privacy issues on
Right,
this stuff.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like, people know that. They've never been asked. They know they're not going to be asked. But what this stuff happening today is what it has done is it has caused good law-abiding citizens. I mean, I've never been arrested. I don't have a rap sheet. I've been a good tax-paying citizen. I'm a integrous business owner. I have a stellar reputation. Try to do things right, by the book, and render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. But what this is forcing me to do as a business owner is to decide, based on my principles, if I'm going to be a lawbreaker. And I have to make this. And I've had people even, in our community tell me, you're just not a loving person. You don't care about other people. And that doesn't faze me, because you can't tell me how much I love people. I know how much I love people, and I know what I do every day for people. And so don't be intimidated by that rhetoric that you're unloving or you don't care for somebody because you don't go along with this. And again, I think the Pastor Jason says it the best, is it has to come down. You have to have principles, and what do you believe, and what do you know is right, and then you got to use those principles to guide your everyday decision making.
Ben Franklin said, if you choose safety over liberty, you deserve neither.
Yeah. Well, and Tony quoted, render unto Caesar, but Jesus, he's quoting Jesus. And you mentioned earlier, Jesus paid taxes.
Right.
He also gave the illustration of the Roman coin. He asked for a coin.
Yeah.
Should I pay? Yeah. He goes, whose inscription's on this? And they said, Caesar's. And he says, render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's. But then he also says, and unto God that which is God's.
Sacred space.
And there are certain things, sacred space. I like to also call them sacred property. There's certain properties that belong to God and that do not belong to government. The church is sacred, not the property, but the church, the institution, is sacred. It's sacred property. But our lives, our bodies, your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost. What? No, you're not. This is the idea. This is sacred. This is sacred property. My body belongs to God, because I have to give an account of it. I have to give an account. So therefore, at what point does my skin provide some sort of sovereignty? Am I sovereign at the point of my skin?
Right.
I get why I can't be sovereign on the roads.
Right.
We need to have some control. We have to obey the speed limits and whatnot, because those actions. But at the point of my skin, does someone else's necessity for perceived safety, which I would question the vaccine, my vaccination status does nothing to help or hinder someone else.
Right.
Because it's not inoculation.
Right.
We've seen that already.
Right.
It's not immunization.
Right.
We're not stopping people from getting a disease. We're at best they can argue you're preventing
serious
illness from the disease, but that doesn't do anything for anyone else's safety.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And man, we go on forever. We can because then they go, well, you're gonna flood the hospitals. Well, then stop firing the nurses.
Right.
Because hospital capacity is not being hindered by bed space. It's being hindered by the number of nurses that you have there. And I'm a little passionate about this. My daughter's a nurse.
Yeah.
And so here are these, and we have church members that have already lost their job because They braved the pandemic when it was dangerous. Remember, these were the heroes
Yeah.
that went into the hospitals and went to the most dangerous environments possible to help serve those that were sick. And now they are not worthy of a job
Villains.
because they have deeply held religious convictions. And what is this conviction? That my skin provides some level of autonomy. The government, you may be able to affect the speed of the roads. You may even be able to affect the air quality. I don't think they can, but they think they can.
Right.
You may be able to affect a lot of things, but you can't tell me how to think. And you can't.
That's sacred.
That's sacred. And you can't inject into my body, especially something that some people have enough cause to believe. And listen,
It's harmful. Yeah.
it's harmful to them, right? Now, listen, he said, well, that's not good science. It's not up to you to determine what someone believes is good science.
Right.
If they want to go to their doctor that here at Memorial and they give them consultation and they want to listen to that, that's fine. But if they want to search the internet and find 20 websites that you might say are pseudo, but they want to believe that those things are true, they have the right to do that, because you can't tell them what to think.
Right. Well, the
You can't tell
media
them what to think.
outlets and the CDC, they have no authority, right? They have suggestion, they have
Right.
influence, but they don't have authority. So yeah, civil disobedience is, I guess, sometimes standing up against bad information or other information. Sometimes it's standing up against, authority. So you have the individual standing up. No, I'm not going to do that. But what about the idea of let's all stand up together?
Yeah.
Let's all stand up together. A mass thing, which is what happened in the revolution. You probably had 35% of the population really stood up and said, we're not paying taxes, and that was enough. And they say maybe 10% actually fought, or something like that.
It was small.
But if we did that on some level, that we might make a difference. I don't know.
Well, and that's really right now is the hour of testing on this, because what we're seeing on this particular mandate is people are being picked off individually.
Yep.
And it's some industries, and what they're trying to do is dilute how many people could actually stand up together.
Right.
This Saturday, I'm going to be speaking at a Consumer Powers protest, because the Consumer Powers employees are being forced to mandate these different things, or are being forced to subject themselves to the mandate, and they're kind of consolidating. They're coming together. And they want to stand up together, which is powerful. But it needs to be every industry, and it needs to be those that are vaccinated.
Right.
Even those that are vaccinated need to say, "Listen, I made a personal choice, but I stand with freedom, and you can't mandate this on somebody else." But you think, look what's happening, and this is what has me concerned. You're having the dismantling of our healthcare system. That's a critical piece of our societal
And our
structure.
education system.
Our educational system
And our police and fire.
well, now
system.
we're
Name
talking
it.
power.
Right.
I'm not an
Yeah.
expert on how consumer power works. I know a windstorm turns out the lights,
Yeah.
and I like the lights and heat being on.
Yep.
It turns out the lights, and then they have to bring in workers from other states,
Yeah.
and it takes some days.
Well-
So to me, if 10% of that workforce is about to be eliminated,
Yes.
our power grid is immediately
In
under
danger.
threat.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on how to overthrow a country, but I know Sun Tzu said the best war is the one that doesn't have overthrow a country without a war.
Yeah.
And so this feels awfully like
Right.
we've
Yeah.
undermined every institution, financial institutions. Every institution has been undermining our election process.
In
Everything
just 18 months.
through
I mean,
this, and I think we should probably have a podcast on the Great Reset.
Yeah.
And
The
people,
agenda.
the people, the book that's been written, COVID-19, the Great Reset, and the people that are involved in that, because it feels awfully like a coup d'etat by
global.
by globalists, mostly European, but by globalists, to ensure that they're going to be on top of the heap
Yeah.
at this particular time, because there's resources are short and all this kind of stuff. So this doesn't stabilize anything. This unstabilizes. That's why Russia has 100,000 troops going into Ukraine. This is why
China's on the move.
Poland, China's on the move. Poland and Belarus are, have this. So we've done this, and it's been unstable with Iran and Israel and all this kind of stuff. So it's just brought instability, fear, war to the forefront. I mean, we've put ourselves in a really bad situation.
Yeah.
And I don't know that if the election was legit or not.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't know if it was legit or not.
And that alone.
And I'm not going to say that Trump's not responsible. He's responsible for his Supreme Court guys,
Yeah.
good and bad. He's responsible for the COVID-19 response, good or bad. he's responsible for those things. But ultimately, we're responsible for these things. And that's why we're doing the podcast, because we think ultimately we have to go back to our spiritual guide. We have to go back to the Bible. The Bible has to influence our culture. And what's happened is it hasn't.
Right. And
Pastors have kind of surrendered back into their pulpits, and they're not out in the public square. They're not preaching about pertinent things. And therefore, people aren't really thinking right. They're more influenced by secular things or Facebook or all these different ideas. And we're saying that basically civil disobedience can be done improperly, done for the wrong reasons, done the wrong way. But it can also be biblical and done right. And ultimately, you have to be willing to pay the price when you step into the arena of civil disobedience.
And I think it's the most powerful when the line is so clearly drawn.
right.
And so that when you can, and that's what the point of this podcast is.
Right.
Is because like in our last 2 years, we've been involved in Stand Up Michigan and the freedom movements. And then you come to speak to some people and you realize you're crying freedom, but you don't know what freedom is.
Right.
Right.
You couldn't define it. You don't know what,
You don't have a guiding principle.
you don't have a guiding principle. You just know you're annoyed.
Right.
And being annoyed is not enough. Or
And it's easy to deal with that kind of rebellion.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
No, but yeah, you get men who have conviction in their heart and it's obedience to God.
Right.
You can't, I mean, that is the story of Christianity for 2,000 years. And so I think we're coming to the end here
Yeah.
a little bit, but so, all this is going on.
Yeah.
I know it gives a lot of believers consternation. We, all three of us have been at the tip of the spear of this, fighting, saying these things, saying the unpopular thing. Go look us up. Before it was vaccine mandates and shutdowns, we were involved in some other causes that brought enough attention to us. And so we're known entities. But I think I can speak for all three of us. We fight the good fight of faith every day. We do what we're supposed to do, but we sleep well at night.
Right.
We don't, the worry and anxiety of what's going on around us doesn't take
Right.
away from our peace, because
Yeah.
the Bible tells us, and history has proven, that in any climate, Christians can prosper.
Yeah.
And so I want to encourage everybody. If you don't have a copy of it yet, you need to go to BibleNation.org or go to our Amazon store and find "Surviving This Babylon."
Yes.
Surviving this. That is if you want to know how am I as a Christian what's supposed to be my personal attitude going through times like these? Because if it's not these times, it's going to be the next times.
Right.
The Bible gives us an example. It gives us a lot of examples. One of the best examples we talked about in this podcast is Daniel, and Daniel had an excellent spirit, and this made him preferred in a scenario where he was unpopular. His way of thinking was unpopular, but he thrived, and he slept well at night. He even slept with lions.
Yeah.
And slept well.
His person and character were good. In all of Western society, Plato, Aristotle, all these people said that, where you have a Western society that's free and democratic and have free markets and things like this, that will succeed, and then people will get rich, and then people will get soft, and then people will get decadent. Okay, so that's not new. So they always said there's got to be these things that ground you in that society: family, you know what I mean, conservatism, responsibility to the state. But ultimately, we would say your faith. So if you're in this decadent society without faith and family and without these grounding pillars, then the decadence is going to be evil, wicked, and one-sided, and all these things. And that's where we are today. And so we've always said it's not just the left's fault; it's Christians' fault for not really doing it right and standing where we need to stand. However, we are definitely at a point of both self-defense and of civil disobedience. And if it's going to be led, it ought to be led by principled people. It ought to have goals behind it. It ought to be, I think, peaceful, because once it's not, it's something different.
It's war.
Yeah, then it's self-defense.
Right.
Then it's, full outright rebellion. And I would say generally I would be opposed to that, right? But when you're not given any choices, what was the line for our founding fathers where they left civil disobedience, not paying the taxes, the Tea Party, things like that? It was when the British marched on their powder. And so that's the Second Amendment, right? Which protects the First Amendment. So the First Amendment's worthy, but the Second Amendment's worthy. And so, that's why the Rittenhouse thing is important. That's why people mass standing up and saying maybe, hey, we're not going to pay our taxes now. We're not going to, that's a threat. If you had 20% of the population sat up and say, okay, that's it, we're not paying our tax, that would create absolute alarm. Somebody'd have to sit down and talk with somebody. There would be compromise on that regard. You were going to say something.
Well, their voices were, without the powder, they had no voice.
Right.
And that's why they had to protect it.
Yes.
So we won, they appealed to King George multiple times.
Yep.
You had the Pennsylvania Quakers
Yeah.
really were anti-war. They did not, and they were a voice in the in the foundation of this country. And they appealed and appealed, but so long as we had powder, our appeal had some force.
And we won the day.
But without the powder, right? And so that's what I'm saying. Once you're defenseless, then your voice means nothing.
Yeah.
Right.
We won the day that day. They came just arrogant.
Yep.
And I think we had 99 or 49 dead, 99,
The
dead
shock
and injured.
heard around
They
the
had
world.
500 dead, like 1,000 dead and injured. And we won the day and then surrounded Boston the next day. And then they had to flee Boston. And then it was on. And that motivated the Declaration of Independence. The victory motivated the Declaration of Independence. If we would have lost that, we'd have never declared independence. So I think individual self-defense, individual right to civil disobedience, and then corporately as well are both American principles that come from scriptural ideas. That's why our forefathers talked about them. And we ought to be willing to go there, but that takes personal principle, personal courage as well, by businessmen, by churches, and by individuals. Last words?
I think it's great. I was going to mention that, you'd mentioned earlier being together, unified, one voice, and, I'll end it by just saying in terms of the Stand Up Michigan movement and the Stand Up Michigan movement, the one thing it has done really well is it has brought a group of people together. And even in the midst that there are now people that are trying to go different directions. And I think the one thing in common that the three of us have, I know the one thing is that we're standing up based on our principles, and our guiding principle is God's word. And so that's always going to be the best thing to stand on, not your personal conveniences. But the power of that voice, like you just said, I recently went with the Shiawassee County GOP over to Lansing and met with the co-chair of the Republican Party here in Michigan. And they were, the Shiawassee County GOP was expressing some grievances of things that were happening with the school boards and things that were happening locally here that were infringements, mandates. And the very first thing the vice chair of the Republican Party of Michigan said is, "Do you have a Stand Up Michigan chapter in your county?" And to me, that was profound, because that has given the people that are involved with Stand Up Michigan at least now have a voice amongst that party. Now, maybe they were just shirking responsibility, but it's in their psyche, it's in their mind. The things that are being talked about within Stand Up Michigan are on the minds now, and it's a pressure that's felt, and the people are together. And that's why coming together and being unified, not just on inconvenience or a frustration, but being unified on the principles of God's word is a power that can't be ignored.
And that's why I've always said the Bible and culture, because he who owns the vocabulary owns the argument. And that's why we got to keep talking, because we got to keep defining things, defining all of it properly from the Word of God. And, one of these days, we have what we call cancel culture today. And that's really an internet phenomena. And that is, you're online, but if we can cancel you online, we cancel you. And I would tell people, make sure that you have a real Bible, not just a digital Bible, because somebody somewhere, somehow, someday is going to try to cancel the Bible.
Yeah.
It's going to become an illegal thing, and it's going to be easy to just have a Google bot out there just trying to change or destroy the Word of God out there. It's going to be canceled. Cancel the Bible online. And so it's important that you have your own Bible in your own home, and that you read it, and that you begin to ask God, what should my principle be? Because this is where it's going to help you. And we want to help you with that at BibleNation.org. So if you've enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to check us out at BibleNation.org. We're on YouTube and Facebook. And of course, we would very much like to hear from you. So we're appreciative. And remember, the best culture is a Bible culture. It's proven and it works.